Good evening and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 26th of May 2026. I am Leela, bringing you today's comprehensive update from India's debt and fixed income markets. Let us begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Goswami Infratech Private Limited recorded a yield of 22.45% with a trade value of 4,006.80 lakhs rupees. Navi Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 18.95% with a trade value of rupees 0.20 lakhs. Kirtana Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 18.67% with a trade value of rupees 0.04 lakhs. Unifins Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 17.25% with a trade value of rupees 50.00 lakhs. Ambium Finserv Limited recorded a yield of 17.15% with a trade value of rupees 0.10 lakhs. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Infi Fresh Foods Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of 150.00 rupees lakhs. Vadraj Cement Limited recorded a yield of 15.00% with a trade value of rupees 3,500.00 lakhs. GMR Infra Projects Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.80% with a trade value of rupees 2,200.00 lakhs. Apex Homes Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 3,198.00 lakhs rupees. Kakinada SEZ Limited recorded a yield of 11.5611% with a trade value of 25,000.00 lakhs rupees. Now let us look at mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 16,557.49 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 23,790.33 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 7,232.84 crore rupees. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative rupees 50,937.160 crore. Moving to foreign portfolio investor debt market investments. Under the general limit category, gross purchases stood at rupees 2.99 crore. Under the voluntary retention route, gross purchases stood at rupees 1,004.20 crore. Under the fully accessible route, gross purchases stood at 426.37 crore rupees. Gross sales under the general limit category stood at 196.60 crore rupees. Gross sales under the voluntary retention route stood at 677.68 crore rupees. Gross sales under the fully accessible route stood at 201.46 crore. Net investment under the general limit category stood at negative 193.61 crore. Net investment under the voluntary retention route stood at 326.52 crore rupees. Net investment under the fully accessible route stood at 224.91 crore rupees. Net investment for May month to date stood at negative 291.25 crore rupees under the general route, 1.25 crore under the general limit category, negative 370.62 crore under the voluntary retention route, and 4,666.10 crore under the fully accessible route. Year-to-date calendar year 2026 net investment stood at negative rupees 3,586 crore under the general limit category, negative 1,775 crore rupees under the voluntary retention route, and 14,874 crore rupees under the fully accessible route. Now to money market rates. Call rate stood at 5.35%. Tri-party repo stood at 5.18%. Basket repo stood at 5.21%. Special repo stood at 5.08%. Here are the India government bond yields. 1-year government bond yield stood at 6.15%. 3-year at 6.67%. 5-year at 6.88%. 7-year at 7.01%. 9-year at 6.92%, 10-year at 7.01%, 15-year at 7.39%, 30-year at 7.66%. Moving to Treasury bill yields and auction cutoffs. 91-day Treasury bill stood at 5.52%, 182-day Treasury bill stood at 5.75%, 364-day Treasury bill stood at 5.98%. Now the liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 76,828 crore rupees, standing 828 crore. Standing deposit facilities stood at rupees 1,68,863 crore. Marginal standing facilities stood at 3,290 crore rupees. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. 1 year stood at 6.18%, 2 years stood at 6.36%, 3 years stood at 6.49%, 5 years stood at 6.69%. Modified MIFOR rates are as follows. 2 years stood at 7.08%, 3 years stood at 7.05%, 4 years stood at 0.00%, 5 years stood at 7.36%. Now to currency rates. US dollar versus Indian rupee stood at 95.70 compared with the previous level of 95.26. Euro versus Indian rupee stood at 111.44 compared with the previous level of 110.93. British pound versus Indian rupee stood at 129.10 compared with the previous level of 128.60. Japanese yen versus Indian rupee stood at 0.60, unchanged from the previous level of 0.60. Chinese yuan versus Indian rupee stood at 14.06, compared with the previous level of 14.04. Let us now look at commodities and market indices. 24-karat gold at 99.9 purity stood at rupees 15,889 per 10 grams, compared with the previous level of 15,938 rupees. Silver stood at 2,850 rupees per 10 grams, unchanged from the previous level of 2,850 rupees. Crude oil stood at $96.17, compared with the previous level of $94.53. The Sensex stood at 24,455, $4.53. The Sensex closed at 76,009.70, compared with the previous close of 76,488.96. The Nifty closed at 23,913.70, compared with the previous close of 24,031.70. Finally, let us look at India primary issuance in corporate bonds. Mahindra Rural Housing Finance Limited announced an issuance of 400 crore rupees with a tenure of 36 months. The coupon is yet to be announced. The issue carries a AAA rating from CRISIL Ratings Limited. 361 Prime Limited announced an issuance of rupees 245 crore with a tenure of 23 months and a coupon of 8.80%. That concludes today's DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 26th of May 2026. Thank you for joining us. This is Leela signing off. Stay informed with DebtCircle.